Hello, my name is Angelo DeLeo from the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. I am presenting a paper for the 9th International Conference ICT for Language Learning from November 17th to the 18th, 2016. My paper is titled Intercultural Perspectives on Language Difficulty and Their Effect on Learner Motivation and Ambition. I will get a little bit more into what that will mean after explaining why this topic in particular. There are a lot of different cultures and different perspectives on language learning in general, based on the different cultures that one comes from. In this paper specifically, I'm focusing on an American perspective, where foreign language learning is not necessarily a very strongly held value, as opposed to, for example, Europe. This may have to do, for example, with English being our native language and having it be such a global language already. As I said, language learning isn't viewed as a very essential skill in the United States, especially for people who don't leave the country very often or even at all. Language ideology is one of the bases for what I am presenting in this paper. It has to do a little bit with preconceived notions of language difficulty, which I will explain in the next slide. And this is an important topic for language pedagogy because, as I will go on to say in the paper, it is very important for a teacher to understand these types of ideological structures when approaching teaching a language. First, before explaining in more detail, I should explain what a linguistic ideology actually is. Generally, it's a reason for why speech patterns or customs and norms exist. It is using language as a justification for acting in a certain way or believing something is true. This is usually culturally contextual, or almost always culturally contextual, and has to do with an interconnecting web of cultural practices, beliefs, and values. There's an example that I use from Woolard and Schieffelin in their article. There are two examples that I want to point out here in particular, that parents in Nova Scotia, for example, might not teach a child their vernacular language for fear that it will hurt their English, which of course is not any scientifically based belief, but rather something that they conceive and believe will happen and be true. Likewise, a Haitian family in New York City might not teach their child Creole because they believe that it will be learned by that child no matter what happens. It's just something that will happen because of their Haitian heritage. This is an example of linguistic ideology. How this ties to Americans and foreign language learning specifically is that, in a little bit of a different way, Americans have an ideology about language learning that what I presume, because it does not happen as often as other places in the world, they may have, especially from people around them, believe that language learning is a very complicated thing to do. Of course it is, but they conflate that with being impossible, especially with more different languages from English that are very stereotypically viewed as being the most difficult in the world, such as Arabic, Mandarin, or Russian. So what I did in this paper is a little bit of a research project having to do with interviews and talking with students on my campus. What I did specifically was analyzed, that I used in this paper, the French, Russian, and Arabic department professors. Just one from each department, and I did interview more, but I chose to use these three because of spatial constraints in this paper. I chose these three. The main focus of these interviews had to do with language learning experience, foreign culture, and travel experience, just to get a proper idea of where they were coming from, what their experiences were, how they shaped their beliefs about how a language should be taught, how their language should be taught, and also how they viewed their students. There is one thing that I want to note in particular from the findings of my interview with the Russian professor at my university. very commonly, something from English speakers that I've heard in general, not just Americans, but mostly Americans, is that a language is very difficult to learn because of a new alphabet. When I asked the Russian professor about this and his students having to learn the Cyrillic alphabet, he told me that because of all the other complexities of Russian, its grammar, its word order, sounding natural versus unnatural, etc., the alphabet should be the least of the students' worries. They finished the alphabet within the first 2 classes, if not the first week. And this was of interest to me in particular because since so many Americans fear a new alphabet, learning a new alphabet, this may be, for some students, throwing some into the deep end, even though some might not, actually have a very big problem with it once they actually get over that hump. But in terms of fears, not necessarily class performance, this may throw students into the deep end, so to speak. With the French professor, I wanted to note how I asked the French professor what they would do if a student came to them looking for help in French. And they took on a very helping role, a very supportive role. He told me that they would always point students in the direction of extra help and practice. So the different programs that they had for French students there, or giving them extra exercises to make sure that they understand the material, extra speaking practice, office hours, etc. And this goes into my portion about professors' attitudes towards teaching. What I noticed from the French teacher's answer is that his methods were very idealistic and supportive, while the Russian professors were realistic and strict. And this, of course, is not to say that all teachers of French or Russian are one way or the other, nor that idealistic or realistic, supportive or strict is a better way to deal with teaching. I just do want to point out that this has to do with language ideology, going back to my main point of argument that the way in which a student believes a language might be determines whether or not they will continue or whether or not they will even start. And so having an idealistic versus a realistic, supportive versus a strict method will either hurt or help a student's ideological preconceived notions to become more realistic, more factually based in their own experiences in the language. In this next portion of the paper, I looked at the quote-unquote most difficult languages being Arabic and Mandarin. Those are specifically, stereotypically viewed as extremely difficult even by native speakers of that language. So, I interviewed the Arabic professor, and what I found very interesting from him is that he had a very strong understanding of why language ideology actually exists. The reasons that he noticed from his experience have to do with the difference between Fusha, which is modern standard Arabic, versus Lahija, which is the dialectal. And the difference is that Fusha is very commonly used in scholarly writing, very formal, even when you're talking to, for example, government officials or people of very high stature. It's a very formal language that not many Arabic speakers actually speak to a very, very high level. Instead, what most people speak in daily life, in common encounters, is the dialectal or the informal, which varies from region to region. Now, the problems that native speakers have with formal language might lead, for example, to for a native speaker praising a foreign learner and also warning them about how difficult it might be and how much they admire them for taking on this huge challenge, quote unquote. This type of behavior can add to an ideology of a foreign learner. And this goes not just for English speakers, but also of any language. In which the L1 and the L2 are very, very different. But from the American perspective in particular, this is something that adds to the ideology that these languages are the most difficult in the world. My experience with Mandarin was a little bit more informal. There are a high number of Chinese students studying at my university currently, and when they come to my dorm room, for example, for language practice or to visit or say hi, I have a few friends. They always, at least the first time, they took surprise at my Chinese grammar book. They wanted to look at my notes from it. They were very inquisitive, tones and writing characters, and they were asking me what I thought of it, how difficult or easy it might have been for me. And something that I realized from this is that generally, for a student studying Mandarin, with this type of behavior coming from native speakers, it might send a subconscious message saying, I'm very surprised that you're learning this. Either for me, it can't be because it's not a commonly studied language, because I think that it's a very widely spoken language. On the contrary. So my only other explanation must be that they believe it's so hard, especially for a foreigner and a native speaker of English. And so this also, in the same token as the Arabic, native speakers may add to a language ideology before actually having studied it, or for a foreign learner, that is. From my findings in these interviews, we looked at a few common themes and what we can learn. Students' perception of a language, therefore, through all of these combined things from personal experience growing up being told that languages are very difficult to learn in general, especially Russian, Arabic, and Mandarin Chinese, this can lead to more or less students joining a class, as well as a higher or lower retention rate, students continuing to study that language and become better, and also how the students perform in that class. This has to do a lot with professors in particular, and how they take on the challenge of teaching their students in a way that will not add to this ideology or make them fearful of the difficulties. As I explained before, language ideology can shape what the most difficult languages in the world actually are. And a good example from the Arabic professor shows that a teacher or a professor, knowing consciously what an ideology is, what the tenets of it are, and why it exists, leads to being able to deconstruct it. Being able to teach your students in a way that recognizes what their fears are, and being able to pull it out of them, necessarily, to teach them that while it is not easy, it is in no way impossible. Having to learn a language involves much of knowing the right method for yourself, putting enough time and effort into it. While this was a broad overview of language ideology in language study, especially at universities, it is much better for this kind of study to be done on a case-by-case basis. While I had neither the time nor the writing space to focus on a specific case, this type of research and this general overview may lead in the future to more case studies on language ideology when learning languages, and hopefully will be useful especially for professors in the field and also researchers, or even self-study language learners, to know what possibly they might have about preconceived notions about a language, let's say. My references for this paper were Silverstein, The Uses and Utility of Ideology, and Woolard and Schieffelin, Language Ideology. These were just to explain examples and background on what language ideology is. All of the rest had to do with personal experience interviewing professors at the George Washington University. Thank you for listening.